Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I see folks are still popping in, so we're just going to go over some logistics to get us started and staying on time somewhat slightly. We're sorry about those technical difficulties we had in the beginning, but we'll go ahead and jump right in. So welcome everyone who's on the line. Hello. This is the first webinar in this new series, Reducing Lead in Drinking Water in Schools and Child Care Facilities. EPA is hosting this quarterly webinar series to highlight examples of efforts across the country to reduce lead in drinking water in schools and in child care facilities. And the slides for this webinar are going to be sent out to all of the attendees and those that registered for the webinar after the webinar. All right, so before we get into the presentation, there's a few housekeeping items to go over. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout this presentation, so don't feel like you have to wait to the end. Feel free to ask throughout any of the presentations, and we will try to address as many as we have time for at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you can use the Q&A box, which is either located on the right-hand panel or at the top of your screen, depending on whether you're in full screen mode. If you don't see it right away, if you put your mouse up to the top of the screen, if you're in full screen mode, there should be a drop-down bar that will show you where some of those tools are. And then to answer a poll, we'll actually get into the poll on the next slide. So it's really helpful for us to know how many people we're reaching and whether these webinars are really valuable or not. So please, I'm going to open the poll up. If you could tell us how many people are in your room, how many are viewing this webinar, it would really help us get an idea of who we're reaching. And then in addition to that, throughout the presentation or at the end, if you find this helpful, if you have suggestions for us on future webinars, feel free to use the Q&A box for something like that as well. We appreciate any type of feedback. I'm going to allow you guys a minute or so to enter this poll. If you're now just joining us, we have a poll open. We are asking you to tell us how many people are in the rooms. We're just trying to get an idea of how many people we're reaching during this presentation today. So if you can answer the poll, it should be in a box probably on the right hand of your screen. And also, if you have more than 5 in your room, we would love to hear how many are actually viewing, and if you could use the Q&A box to share that information, again, we'd really appreciate it. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on. Thanks to everyone who was able to answer that poll. We really appreciate that. Okay, so I mentioned this is a series, and we're going to be highlighting different states or water systems or public water system states, school districts, anyone who is out there trying to reduce lead levels in schools or child care facilities. So today we are lucky enough to have presenters from Denver Water and Denver Public Schools. But before I pass it over to them, we're going to just do a quick background on lead and lead in drinking water in case it's new to anybody. So again, I'm just going to go through this quickly since some people are more familiar with this area, and then I'll turn it over to Denver. So first, first, just general information about lead. Lead is a toxic metal. It affects multiple body systems, particularly the nervous system, and there is no known safe blood level, and children are most vulnerable to lead exposure because of their developing brains and nervous system. And in toddlers, frequent hand-to-mouth activities increase their potential to ingest lead. Most of the dysfunctions produced by the absorption of lead are due to the lead's ability to mimic and inhibit the actions of calcium. What is not excreted is absorbed into the bones where it can collect for a lifetime. This means that lead stored in the bones may be remobilized into the blood during pregnancy, thus exposure to a fetus. Undernourished children are more susceptible to lead because of their bodies absorb more lead than other nutrients, such as calcium, and that calcium is lacking. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, there's no safe blood lead level. Even low levels of lead in the blood may affect a children's ability to pay attention, their behavior, and development. Most children with elevated blood lead levels do not exhibit any symptoms. However, effects may appear later in age. Other health effects may include kidney damage, anemia, and reduction in birth weight. Symptoms of severely affected blood lead levels, aka lead poisoning, may include stomach aches, vomiting, poor appetite, or nausea. The effects of lead cannot be corrected. And the most important steps parents and doctors and others can take is to prevent lead exposure before it occurs. So sources of lead. There are multiple sources of lead. Lead is distributed in the environment through natural and man-made means. Today, the greatest contribution of lead in the environment stems from past activities, and we are exposed to lead from different sources, like you're seeing on this slide. So paint, solder, consumer products, and then through different pathways such as air, food, dust, soil, and of course, water. The primary source of exposure to children is lead-based paint used inside or on houses built before 1978, but however, it is estimated that 20% or more of human exposure to lead may come from lead in drinking water. So a little bit more on lead in drinking water. Children in schools and child care centers may be exposed through water or food that has been prepared by contaminated water. And something not everyone knows is that formula-fed infants can receive up to 40 to 60% of their exposure from lead in drinking water. It's very important to monitor lead in the home as well. And then another thing is lead in drinking water has no taste, scent, or odor, so it's not always easily detectable without actually testing. And an important note is that boiling water will not get rid of lead. So lead can enter the drinking water by being present in the source water. It can come from contaminated runoff or water pollution, but however, this isn't as typical. Typically, treatment plant technologies can remove these sources of lead. Most lead gets into drinking water after it leaves the local well or treatment plant and comes in contact with plumbing materials that contain lead. These include lead pipes and lead solder, as well as faucets, valves, and other components made of brass. Although brass can contain low levels of lead, lead can still dissolve in the water, especially when the fixtures are new. And then the physical-chemical interaction that occurs between the water and plumbing is referred to as corrosion. The extent in which corrosion contributes to the amount of lead can vary and can then in turn vary in release in drinking water. And that's what this slide is talking about. There's many factors that affect the amount of lead that leaches into water. So soft, corrosive, or non-acidic, aka low pH water, is more likely to cause leaching. And then another thing that's just especially important in places like schools where water that is left standing over a long period of time can also increase leaching. So basically, the longer the water stands in the pipes, the greater the possibility that the lead is being dissolved in the water. So for facilities with intermittent water use patterns, like schools, the risk could be elevated. So I'll just quickly touch on some of the ways that lead in drinking water is regulated. There's the lead ban that defined what lead-free is, and then the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act, which was in 2011, that further reduces lead in pipes and defining lead-free. And then we have the Lead Contamination Control Act, which was in 1988, and that was aimed at schools and child care facilities. EPA was required to provide guidance. Schools were required to test and remove lead-lined water coolers. However, the implementation and enforcement of the testing portion is at the state's discretion. And then there's the Lead and Copper Rule, which regulates water systems, and one of its main goals is to minimize corrosivity and therefore the amount of lead and copper in drinking water. Okay, so most schools and child care centers receive their drinking water from a public water supply. However, there are some schools that have their own on-site water system or well and therefore are considered a public water system. And those that are public water systems are required to regularly test the water to ensure that it meets the federal and state drinking water standards. If the public water supplier finds unacceptable levels of lead at consumers' homes, the systems may have to provide centralized treatment to minimize the corrosion of lead in drinking water. However, centralized treatment by a public water system may not guarantee that the corrosion of lead from plumbing will not occur within a building that's served by a public water system. And I think the critical issue here is that even though your public water supplier may be delivering water that meets all federal and state public health standards for lead, schools may end up with lead in drinking water because of the plumbing within their facility, so their internal plumbing. And this is showing you the water in the distribution system coming from the water supplier, and this is this internal plumbing, so the school's plumbing. As water moves through the school's plumbing, lead can leach in drinking water from plumbing materials and fixtures that contain lead. And of course, testing is the best way for schools to know if there are elevated lead levels in their drinking water. And this slide is just to show you that there is a federal, EPA recommendations for schools and child care facilities for testing, for communicating and remediation. It is the 3 T's, so 3 T's is training, testing, and telling, and it comes with a bunch of tools. The website at the bottom will lead you to more information, some helpful templates, some that are specific for communication, some for public water systems, some for child care facilities. So I would encourage anyone that's looking for more resources to check that page out. Okay, so I'm done with my spiel, and I'm going to pass it over to Denver Water and Denver Schools. But before I do, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. So first we're going to have Melissa Elliott, and Melissa's job is to see around corners to make sure Denver Water is prepared for what's coming in the public arena. In fact, her boss has nicknamed her the Oracle. The municipal water utility serves more than 1.4 million people, and her role of Director of Public Affairs means she works with the eclectic mix of issues, from permanently cutting water use in her city by more than 20%, to leading a movement to get water utilities to raise the public awareness of lead service lines in Denver, and across the nation to ensuring customers felt comfortable with the utility's first rate structure change in 20 years. Melissa has found that if you always work to encourage the public and truly listen, they know you are a trusted source. The water industry is being buffeted by complex, expensive challenges like water quality crises and failing infrastructure. Melissa urges her peers to go beyond proactive and get to prescriptive to influence the outcome by getting out there and talking to people about the role we play in protecting public health, because water connects us all. After Melissa, we're going to pass it over to Nick Schroeder. Nick is an environmental specialist at Denver Public Schools, the largest school district in the state of Colorado. He primarily focuses on the water quality within the school district. For the past 10 years, he has targeted water resources and quality through education and experience in both urban and wildland settings. Backed with a degree in forest hydrology and 10 years of project management experience, He has provided extensive support and knowledge to the Denver Water Denver Public Schools water sampling effort. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Melissa.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm very pleased to be with you today, along with Nick at Denver Public Schools, to share with you our highly successful partnership. While this has definitely been a learning experience for both agencies, we feel that ultimately this is an excellent example of the core mission of both of our organizations. Water utilities protect public health, and public schools ensure that students and employees have a safe learning environment, where we've definitely succeeded in blending those missions with this partnership. Today we're going to go over how Denver Water and Denver Public Schools developed their partnership, and our hope is that those listening can use us as a model. In our presentation, we'll be covering how utilities can help schools understand the source of lead in drinking water in schools, how to make laboratory services available, which can be a huge cost barrier to school districts that wish to test their water, how to involve regulators and public health agencies in the process, developing a sampling plan and the proper sample collection technique, and how Denver Public Schools mitigated fixtures with high lead levels, and how we reviewed and shared results in a transparent way to maintain community trust. And of course, there'll be lessons to share with other communities at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. I wanted to start with a bit of background about Denver Water. We're a public water utility serving 1.4 million people in the Denver metro area. And like all water providers, we've participated in the EPA's lead and copper rule lead testing program since 1992. Each year, Denver Water collects more than 35,000 samples and runs more than 68,000 water quality tests. Lead is not present in the mountain streams and reservoirs that supply our water, and it isn't found in the water when it leaves our treatment plants or travels through our system's water mains. Although lead isn't present in the water Denver Water sends to its customers, as Victoria explained earlier, lead can get into water as it moves through lead-containing plumbing and service lines, which are the two most common sources of lead in treated drinking water. The city of Denver does have thousands of lead service lines still in place, primarily serving single-family households. We are working with the community to remove those privately owned lines over time. Denver Water has a comprehensive lead education program and provides free water quality testing to all residential customers and to commercial and institutional customers serving vulnerable populations. This includes public school districts. We strongly believe our community will be safer when we remove all forms of lead exposure. Next slide, please. While Denver Water has been communicating about the risks of lead exposure coming from lead-containing plumbing for more than 25 years, the tragedy in Flint provided an opportunity for additional public education. Frankly, while we've been talking with our customers about lead in drinking water, it took the media coverage that the Flint water quality crisis garnered for consumers in our area to engage in that discussion with us about what we should do about lead in our community. We took that community interest and were determined that all public schools in our service area, and there are 9 school districts in our large service area, we wanted them all to have an opportunity to test their water free of charge to ensure that children had safe drinking water at their schools. Many schools are stressing the importance of water consumption over sodas and juice in their own schools. So we felt strongly that we wanted to provide a path to testing and remove that cost barrier. With so many schools in our service area, we had to phase this, so we approached the largest district first, Denver Public Schools. The district had been testing water in some schools for a while, and that was to address corrosion concerns, but it had never tested all drinking water sources. In addition, because lead service lines were known to be installed at properties in our community through the mid-1950s, including in some commercial and institutional settings, we wanted to ensure that there were no lead service lines serving some of these older school properties. Next slide. Denver Public Schools was receptive to our offer, and we set about determining how to go about testing. No other districts had done a comprehensive program like this in our state, so we knew we'd be learning a lot and that we could share that with others. But we had some parameters of what we wanted to do together. This critical guidance led us through the process so that when a question arose, we could always look on this and answer, what's the right thing to do? So there were 3 main areas we wanted to focus on. The first was a true community partnership, where Denver Water would be providing the bottles and the analysis, And the school district would do all the sampling and the transport. So we both had some buy-in here. Next was strong science was critically important. We wanted to ensure we were following the sampling processes that were outlined in the EPA guidelines. And we also wanted to make sure that our sampling was done on a Tuesday through Saturday when school is in session. This will be important for those of you who are just starting to work with school districts. There's always an interest in doing this testing when nobody's there, during the summer breaks or the spring breaks or the weekends, and that's exactly when you don't want to do the testing. We wanted to mimic when the water was used by the students and the teachers in the school. So DPS was great at working with us, and they actually ended up testing mostly Tuesday through Friday in their program. The third area was transparency. It was critically important that all the sample results be made available to parents, guardians, and school employees, and that urgent attention would be paid to fixtures that needed mitigation. And so in conversations with the school districts, we will say that they have to place things on the website. It has to be done very quickly. It has to be done in a very transparent manner. And Denver Public Schools was excellent at working with us on that. Next slide. We also insisted upon bringing in our regulators and the Public Health Agency when we set up the procedures for this testing program. As I talk with other utilities across the nation, I find that that's an unusual step, but I'd strongly urge you to put your state health department, your EPA region, and your county health department at the table when you start talking about what you want to do. The feedback I received from our regulators and the Public Health Agency was that they valued this experience and gained insight into our plan. That meant they could support our efforts when asked about them and provide guidance up front. And frankly, they are the public health experts, and so any kind of questions about lead and public health or children's health could be addressed by them and not the water utility or the school district, who aren't the experts in that. We also reached out to other water utilities nationally to get their lessons learned. One thing that was invaluable was that we were able to talk with several communities where testing had not gone well. And in every instance, this was because of a perceived lack of transparency when the results came back in. It was critical that results be shared very quickly, that problem fixtures were shut down immediately, and that parents, guardians, and school employees knew what was happening and why. Next slide. Lastly, I want to cover how Denver Water made their laboratory services available. When we began working with Denver Public Schools, they stressed that the cost of testing water samples through a certified lab was a huge barrier to them. We felt strongly that we could provide this service free of charge, so we went about preparing to do this. This is a significant commitment of time and resources for a lab, and at the end of this presentation, I'll be explaining some of the lessons we learned. Suffice to say for now that this was a pretty heavy lift, and still is as we continue to do testing for schools and consumers. And now I'll turn it over to Nick to tell you how Denver Public Schools entered this story.
Thanks, Melissa. Nick here. Great to be here to share our story and partnership that we had with Denver Water. Share my screen real quick.
Nick, while we're passing the presenter mode over to you, I wanted to just remind everyone who's able to listen in today that you guys can feel free to ask questions. The Q&A box is either on the right side of your screen or at the top, and we will be addressing those questions at the end of today's presentation. Also, if you missed the poll at the beginning, if you could let us know how many people are watching, how many people are in your room watching, it would be really helpful for us to see how many people we're reaching. It lets us see whether these webinars are worth it and well received. So thanks, and go ahead, Nick.
Excellent. Thanks, Victoria. So just to provide a background with our school district to give an idea of scope of what we were looking at to do our first district-wide sampling effort. Water sampling was, something we had done in the past on a school-by-school basis, with the first sampling occurring in 1989, right after the LCCA passed. As of fall 2016, we have just over 92,000 students in our district, with close to 12,000 total employees. Our kitchen services creates roughly 37,000 breakfasts per day, 48,000 lunches, and close to 7,000 snacks per day. We identified 166 DPS buildings, which is pretty much all of our buildings, including service and admin buildings for the sampling. So we didn't ban anything in terms of date built. We just decided to do everything. And like I mentioned, this was our first district-wide effort. So the first step was developing a sampling plan. And as Melissa alluded to earlier, we had staff in-house to help support the actual sampling effort. And so we needed to develop a plan. We collaborated with Denver Water in terms of creating our standard operating procedure, agreed upon testing sites and that procedure, and also the priority and frequency in which we'd be sampling. The other part of that was the communication plan, and this was a really critical step. Before we even started sampling, we made sure that we had our ducks in a row and things documented on how we were going to communicate results. Our action and response plan was in place before we even took a sample, and so that when the data started rolling in, we had a plan laid out and we were able to execute. We also worked pretty closely with our communications group internally at Denver Public Schools and the leadership within DPS. Denver Water was also involved with creating a video, and we created a DPS dedicated website for this effort that had the letters in multiple languages, and we had a press release and a results sharing process in place before we even began. So I'm going to talk real quick about the service line assessments before we get into the weeds with the drinking water effort. As Melissa mentioned, they had their residential lead service line program going on for a while, and we had an idea that there could be the potential for a lead service line going into a school building. So we identified 66 buildings that were built before 1956 as targets for this investigation. And our original plan was it was kind of piggybacked off the residential program of doing first draw versus flush samples collected off of a backflow preventer based on the service line size and trying to get into a stagnation time. And so our second sample was pulling from that service line, and if we had a hit, it would be indicative of a lead line. But the school buildings have a lot going on, a lot more going on than what a single-family household has, and so we found the data to be pretty inconclusive in a lot of variables. And we moved forward with a potholing and meter pit assessment program for the 66 buildings. And so that went around, and we essentially dug down and got right to the lines on both sides of the meter and did a scratch test, visual test, and a magnet test to determine if there was lead or not. We did not find any lead service lines, and so good news there. So moving to the drinking water collection, since we were doing this in-house, we had to train all the samplers on the procedure. We used some technicians from our shops department to help with the effort. The priority of the buildings was driven by the age of the building and the age of the occupants within the building. And so the oldest building with the youngest students was the highest priority. Our oldest school was built in 1889, and so we have a pretty decent range in terms of age. And when we created the SOP, it was really based off of 3T's document with a few other things added, but we really focused on the minimum stagnation period of 8 hours. As Melissa mentioned, our sampling primarily occurred Tuesday to Friday. We did do some Saturday mornings during the school year, and this was helpful for the larger school buildings, such as high schools and larger middle schools, just because we couldn't get the sampling completed during a normal weekday when students start to show up pretty early. We did first draw collection with no pre-flushing of the lines, and no water was to be used in the building until sampling was completed. We targeted all drinking fountains, bottle fill stations, lounge sinks, kitchen prep sinks, nurse sinks, and classroom sinks for our sampling. We created a pretty tight chain of custody and documentation because, we were doing this in-house. We wanted to make sure we, could pinpoint every single sample to its location, time, and who took it, and when did we take it to Denver Water, and when did that transfer of samples happen. And creating a unique sample ID for each sample based on building number, room number, source type, and then a consecutive sample count. And then we utilize floor plans to identify locations. Our sampling effort was done in 2 phases. The first phase was targeting more of the drinking fountains, kitchen sinks, lounge sinks, nurse sinks. In the second phase, we went back and really hit all the classroom sinks. As of to date, we're still conducting our phase 2 sampling. We have middle and high schools to do in the fall, and we've collected just over 7,000 samples. Just to give you a sense of the time invested that we did internally to do the collection, we were starting about 5:30 in the morning. It took about 4 hours per school to do just the sampling. It was usually about 1 to 2 hours of sampling in the building, plus half hour to an hour of drive time based on the size of our district and the distance of the school, and about an hour of documentation to create sample labels, the chain of custody forms that you just saw, and about a half an hour of data entry, metadata, and making sure that we had digital records of everything going on. So to date, with part of phase 2 completed and all of phase 1 completed, it's just over 1,100 sampling hours just for the sample collection that it took. And so we, in phase 2, have close to 3,000 samples collected this spring, and we have 54 buildings scheduled for this fall. Because again, it gets into you don't want to be sampling during extended break periods. So reviewing results as the data rolls in, the primary thing was finding hits and taking the first action. We used the action level of 15 parts per billion. This was decided because it was in line with the National Primary Drinking Water Standards. It is something we've been using in the district for some time now, and the published 3Ts document references 20 parts per billion, and we decided to go with 15. Fixtures that test high will see a like-for-like replacement. Of a district of our size, that can take some time. So we identified that we needed some interim actions to, basically respond to that faucet or drinking fountain until we could get the repairs made. So for a drinking fountain, it was an immediate shutdown. We would ask the facility managers to shut them down, and we would go through. We had tags with our contact information so that if any plumbing or a third-party contractor was coming to do work and they came across the fixture, they wouldn't be turning it back into service, similar to a lockout, tag-out procedure. If it was a classroom or other sink that served a function but wasn't for consumption, we would again have the FMs, the facility managers, talk with the staff and say, this is for washing and cleaning only, and we'd post a notice sign. The sinks that were identified for consumption that you couldn't really get around with just saying, hey, this is just for washing, such as a nurse sink or a lounge sink or actually kitchen sources, we would post a flush notice and then confirm with the field test that the flushing actually reduced the levels of lead. Sharing the results. Like I mentioned before, we had a dedicated web page, and so this picture here is a screenshot of that where you can have our video. Our website's listed right there if you want to view it later. It's pretty easy to find. Just Google Denver Public Schools water, and it'll pop up. This is where we share all of our results. We have our communications out to families, and as the results would roll in, we would finalize them, summarize the interim actions taken, and send that to our communications department. And then they would take the template letter and our results and send those to the principals at each school. And then the principals would have a nice little package to then send the letter out to the community to notify them. This is the summary table of the results. So as you can see here, we have our sample ID, a description of where the sample was taken, the result, and any action that needed to be taken. So we had a sink here that tested at 17.2 parts per billion. It was a lounge sink, and so we couldn't take it out of service or just notify it as a washing only. And we had a flush result pass, and that's how we communicated those steps. So as of today, we're still receiving data for samples collected from the spring. We have data for roughly 5,600 samples. Of those 5,600 samples, 3.3% of them have been equal or greater than 15 parts per billion, which historically at the testing we had done, we were anticipating around 4 to 5%. And so it's better, but pretty close to in line of what we had expected. And as you can see, there's a range in it. The count of samples that tested high drops, but then we get into the greater than 50 parts per billion where we see a little spike. And there's a few things there that's going on that we'll talk about in a little bit, but it kind of gets into fixtures that are just never used, or someone had put up a whiteboard behind a sink and they just sit. And so what we found is that about 60% of our hits have been sinks, 33% have been sourced from a drinking fountain, and 6% have been from kettle fills and kitchens, which we found that are also pretty rarely used. The other interesting thing that we found with the data set so far is that of the 190 hits that we have data for, 126 of them, so just over 66%, are from buildings that were built from an 11-year period from 1950 to 1960. And so on this graph here in the blue, we have the number of hits, and in the orange, we have the number of buildings that saw a hit. And it's still pretty spread out. You know, we had a hit from a building that was built, I think it was in 2001, is what's shown there on the far right. And as early as the early 1900s. But really the bulk of the lead that we found in our school district was from that period of 1950 to 1960. So mitigating fixtures. So you have an interim action, but it also takes time. And this is really, I think, the real bear of the project, where the sampling is kind of the tip of the iceberg, and then you start getting the results, and you have to take these actions. And so the real critical thing in terms of showing transparency and being able to track over time is that you really need to have detailed records of every action and response that you took on something. You know, the end goal is like-for-like replacement, but as you see here in the picture, we have our field test kit, our sign saying you must flush this sink, and it's a little pixelated, but the test kit did say it was less than 2 parts per billion, so that was a pass. As I mentioned, we're planning for the like-for-like replacement, and before we return a fixture back to service, we will need to conduct follow-up testing to deem that safe and confirm that the level has been reduced. We've also, having older buildings in our district, we've also identified an opportunity to install bottle fill stations and drinking fountains within our schools. Some of our schools still have them, and so it's, they've been trickling in. And this opportunity is something that we're looking to do and have for any school that had a hit. We're looking to add 2 of the chill filtered bottle fill stations at that school. We know people like them, we know they use them, and we know it's a safe source for water. And so rather than if there's a opportunity where we're doing a like-for-like replacement in a drinking fountain in the cafeteria, rather than just putting a bubbler back in there, we'll upgrade it and put it in the bottle fill station. The cost of all of this, however, is a little daunting. So it's, in terms of the sampling cost, concerns, the actual replacement cost is the big one. So a drinking fountain replacement just for the actual fixture can run from $600 to $1,500 if you're just doing like for like, plus the labor to do the installation. Fortunately, we have a pretty hefty shops department and a plumbing department that is able to help us on this, and so they'll be going around and helping, assisting with the faucet and stop replacements. So more findings. Here on the left is a kettle fill next to a flat top that we have found, just indicative of certain use patterns where talking to kitchen staff that have been in a certain kitchen for 5 years, and they say, oh, I've never used that since I've been here. So if you think about max stagnation time, we're well beyond that. And so that's where we were seeing, you know, a bit of a spike in our higher hits. The drinking fountain in the center top, we've found replacements have been made, but maybe the stop valves were never replaced, and so those could be the potential source. In the center of the group of images, we have 2 hand washing sinks, a little bottle fill station, and in this room, there's likely 3 more sinks on another wall. And so when you're estimating our sample counts, we drastically underestimated. Once we started getting out there and looking into things, you know, and you think about if I was a kid and I was brushing my teeth, if I could use any of these things, it ramped up pretty quickly. We also found that dirty aerators could be a good source. So if we had a hit looking at a sink, you pop off the aerator. It's pretty common to find quite a bit of chunks in there as well. So to circle back, lessons to share. From our end, from Denver Public Schools, you know, I think the big success here is the communicating early and working with Denver Water, our utility, and the regulatory agencies, even before sampling starts, to vet our plan and to say this is what we're doing, and do we all agree? Are we all on the same page? The other thing that's kind of come to light to this is, you know, we've been testing since 1989 on a school-by-school basis, but really this district-wide sampling is a snapshot in time, and we kind of view it as a whack-a-mole. And so something that we're currently discussing is continued testing and based on a frequency and priority, such as something like we would test all the schools in our districts on a 5-year turnaround with a certain priority. Colorado also recently passed a House bill that provides a grant program to pay for testing. It's called Safe Water in Schools Act. It roughly is budgeted about, I think it's $300,000 per fiscal year that schools can apply to get funding to do testing within their districts. But this doesn't provide funding for the replacement. So something to keep in mind there. We were fortunate to where we just passed a 2016 construction bond that actually had a line item for lead service lines on there. And as you recall, we didn't find too much lead service lines, but we did find lead in our schools, and so we're able to use some of that bond fund to do the mitigation of the fixtures. And as I mentioned to you before, really the big burden in terms of dollars is going to be in the fixture replacement. And I will turn it over to Melissa to discuss their findings.
Thanks, Nick. So from the water utility perspective, if you're considering doing the testing for school districts, make sure you have adequate lab capacity or a plan B. We were trucking along fine until, as Nick told you, the number of samples was increasing as they were finding additional water sources in the schools. To compound that, in January we lost 3 employees to retirement, and they were the ones that were running the tests for us. So we had to scramble. We used some state-certified labs to try to make up the testing, and of course you can preserve these samples for quite a lengthy time, months. But the fact is, you've sampled in a school, let's say in November, and if you're not getting a result back till February, you're leaving the school district a bit in a lurch with communicating to their community about what has happened to that sample. So that is critical, and always expect more samples. We've seen that with other school districts as well. They thought they had a really good handle on it, and it comes back almost double when we get those. And then, of course, there is no safe level of lead known in drinking water, so be prepared to discuss that with school districts when they're choosing what level of lead they want to sample to. The 3 Ts gives you up to the 20 parts per billion as their guidance, but you can certainly drop it down, as Denver Public Schools did, and have that conversation as well. Nick, can you push to the next slide? So some key takeaways that we've had, just to sum this all up before we head to questions. Proactively communicating is key. That lab analysis can be expensive, and utilities should be considering truly whether they can help school districts and their community up with that. Building trust by being transparent about those testing results is critical, and then having those sampling, communication, and response plans in place before you do any sampling. It's really a problem when school districts get pretty excited about doing this. They think they might want to test a few schools to see what it's like before they launch into this, before they tell anyone about it, and then all of a sudden it's out that there perhaps is a lead problem in a school, and they're scrambling to react to that. So better to be proactive and get your plan in place and let people know you're going to test in the future than to kind of sample here and there and then see what you want to do. And the next slide, Nick. And Nick and I just wanted to share these resources with you before we wrap up for questions. That's Denver Water's site related to lead, and you can get information there. There's Denver Public Schools testing site. American Water Works Association, if there's utilities on the line, has a great lead resource page available to anyone, even if you're not a member of that association. All kinds of materials there. And of course, EPA's 3 Ts for reducing lead in drinking water is the primary guidance that we have for this program. And with that, I think, Victoria, we'll turn it back to you to do some questions.
Great, thanks. Thank you both for that awesome presentation. We're going to take the next 10 minutes to go through some of these questions. And I'm going to go ahead and start off with an easy one, which is this presentation, are the presentation slides going to be sent out to attendees? And that, I think I said that in the beginning, but yes, if you didn't hear, we are going to send out the presentation slides to all the attendees and those that were registered for this at the end of this presentation. This one, maybe Nick or Melissa could answer, is what sample volume did you use?
We used 500 mil samples. 3 Ts recommends a 250, and after talking with Denver Water and some of our plumbing shop, we were also pretty curious to see what was behind the walls in the plumbing systems for lead solder, sort of beyond the fixture, so to say.
Okay, and I think that you guys spoke to us a little bit, but we did get a question about funding again. Were there any state or federal fundings that you were able to use, or was it all Denver schools and Denver Water?
This was entirely funded by the water utility and the school district. No funds are available at the time we did this. The state has just put legislation in place to allow for some funding for just testing in the future, but that hasn't been implemented yet.